If there is one group of game developers I respect the most, it has to be those who create horror games. For a horror game to be successful, it means that the developers had to create an environment that scared or at least creeped out the majority of players, and that skill is one of the most difficult to master. Recently, while I was playing through my annual Halloween games, I started to wonder about what it takes to effectively pull this off. I mean, why are some horror games universally more frightening than others? And most importantly, how do horror games scare us? Much like everyone else, when Halloween begins to roll around, I start to crave the thrill of terror, and ever since I was young, I have always taken this time to replay my favorite spooky titles. Throughout these past couple of months, I've played through Little Nightmares, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, Five Nights at Freddy's, Iron Lung, and of course my yearly tradition, Luigi's Mansion. Today, Luigi's Mansion and Majora's Mask are not titles that I would consider creepy, but back when I was younger, they captured my imagination in ways no other games had. Even the simple stuff like unlocking a new room in the mansion sent a shiver down my spine that I will never forget. Everything felt just a little off from what I was used to, and it caused me to overthink every aspect of these games. And because of these reasons, I continue to keep these titles in the group of games I play every Halloween. And on the scarier side, Iron Lung and Little Nightmares are both titles that I have added somewhat recently, which is greatly due to the fact that they are both extremely polished and memorable experiences. I can vividly remember the first time I played Little Nightmares and the intense feeling of anxiety I would get while trying to sneak around the terrifying environment. And I can still recall the last moments before my submarine would inevitably be compromised in Iron Lung. Doki Doki Literature Club and Five Nights at Freddy's are two titles that had an incredible impact on me when I played them the first time, but due to the nature of these titles, I usually have to wait a bit longer than a year to fully enjoy these titles again. And I also dabble in some Walking Dead Saints and Sinners when my virtual reality binge rolls around every couple of months. All in all, these games tend to be my go-to scary games, which is interesting because they are far from the only horror games I've played, and they certainly are not one of a kind. For some reason, these games seem to leave more of an impression than games such as Bendy and the Ink Machine and Poppy's Playtime. And what's really strange is that a lot of people seem to universally agree on which titles are scary and which ones aren't. When patterns like these start to emerge in subjectivity, it usually means that there is something more to be seen, especially when it comes to game design. Because of this, I decided to take a look at the titles that most people considered creepy and compare them with the titles that people don't. For starters, we have the titles that people do find scary. Obvious titles such as Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Silent Hill, and of course Outlast. Each of these titles is a well-known staple of the horror genre, and for good reason. Silent Hill redefined the horror genre by creating an environment that wasn't dependent on shooting everything in sight. Outlast threw even horror veterans off every step of the way, and Amnesia single-handedly spawned a new category of helpless survival games. And along with these games are the indie titles such as Five Nights at Freddy's, Iron Lung, and of course Little Nightmares, as I mentioned before. But what's really interesting are the titles that people don't find scary. Hello Neighbor, when it was first around, was a game that people thought successfully pulled off a creepy atmosphere, which seemed to immediately fade within the next couple of months. Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is widely thought of as not scary in the slightest, and Bendy and the Ink Machine 2 seemed to somehow get rid of everything that made the first title work. And although it is easy to throw mascot horror under the bus, this isn't the only time we see horror games completely miss the mark. People have seemed to reach a general consensus that the Resident Evil series keeps getting less terrifying, and a game like Dead by Daylight, which literally utilizes the most famous characters in horror, doesn't even make people's general list of horror titles. Meanwhile, a game like Subnautica will send shivers down people's spines even with no fear of the ocean, and the Thief series causes people anxiety even when they are the threat within the game world. Of course, when you look at these patterns at face value, they seem to not mean anything, but when you take a look at the way these games utilize the fundamental design principles, you start to realize that it's not as arbitrary as you may think. Now, if you would like a more in-depth explanation on what the fundamentals of game design are, then make sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel. But for now, we will briefly recap on the 5 main design principles. The sense of reward is the concept of creating a positive emotional response towards the game designer's desired actions. The sense of punishment is the idea of the designer creating a negative emotional response towards unwanted behavior from the player. Goals are what give the player a reason to seek out a sense of reward, or in other words, goals give the player a reason to perform the desired actions of the game designer. Constraints allow the player to feel the sense of punishment in meaningful ways. Basically, constraints are what empower the designer to impose a sense of punishment in the first place. And lastly, we have the concept of consistency. Consistency is what keeps the player in the knowledge of what everything means. Without consistency, a player can't know what actions permit rewards and which actions conclude with punishments. Now, it is important to note that most genres have a generic outline for the 5 fundamentals, and this is definitely true when it comes to horror games. Horror titles usually create a sense of reward in response to a player surviving longer, and the sense of punishment mirrors this aspect by punishing players for, well, not surviving. Goals are only obtainable by getting better at surviving, and the constraints keep the player from completing their goals if they aren't successfully improving. Lastly, a horror game's consistency stems from the game designer always encouraging the survival of the player, and this general outline is still apparent when it comes to the most terrifying games, but it is used in slightly different ways. When looking at the scariest horror games, you start to notice that instead of the game designer focusing on the basic idea of surviving longer, they focus on the idea of progression. Of course, progression naturally means that you will be surviving longer, which is why the generic horror outline is still apparent. The difference is that in the most terrifying games, you can survive for as long as you want by simply not moving or hiding. But not only will this result in no sense of reward, it will also result in a sense of punishment. As a result of these ideas shifting, the sense of punishment takes on a new shape. Instead of focusing on punishing the inability to survive, a good horror game focuses on punishing the inability to progress. Now, instead of your goals being created by your desire to live longer, your goals are formed around the idea that progressing is not only the desired action, but the only action you are able to take. And of course, the constraints keep the player from backtracking to, say, a safer location, as that action would result in you feeling a sense of reward for not progressing. Lastly, a great horror game's consistency is changed so slightly that it almost deceives the player into believing that a game is scarier than it is. Because the goal has switched from length of survival to progression, the game is able to subconsciously encourage the player to do the opposite of what they think is right. In a scary horror game, sometimes you need to die or you need to get caught in order to progress the overall game, and this action makes you feel like the consistency is broken, but to the designer, you have unknowingly completed the goal. This contradiction between the game's design and our mind's instincts create a heightened sense of anxiety and fear. Now, this is a little difficult to picture abstractly, so let's take a look at some more tangible examples. For starters, let's take a look at a horror game people don't find scary. Dead by Daylight is a game that very closely follows the generic outline of horror games. Players are rewarded for surviving longer. They are punished by dying too quickly. Their goal, which is to escape the location, is only able to be completed by increasing the amount of time they are alive. The game's constraints are built around the idea that you have to survive, and the game is consistent in its message that dying doesn't help you acquire your goal. Now, the game can have frightening moments, but all in all, its experience doesn't terrify its players. In contrast, we have a game like Outlast, which uses a slightly different outline that seems to create a more intense experience. Instead of surviving longer, the player is rewarded by pushing past and progressing through the terrifying building. And instead of being punished just for dying, the player is more focused on the fact that staying still or not progressing will result in a worse outcome. The goal is to escape the asylum, and from the very beginning of the game, you realize that the only way forward is through the building. No amount of backtracking will result in a safer situation. In fact, the player operates under the assumption that whatever is next couldn't possibly be too much worse than what's already behind them. Lastly, because the game is always consistent in its desire to move the player forward, the game is able to trick the player into doing actions they would normally never do, and these subtle differences seem to be the make or break of a lot of horror titles. Take for example the difference between Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and Five Nights at Freddy's 2. These two titles specifically revolve around the idea of surviving longer, but in Five Nights at Freddy's 2, the music box reminds you constantly of the fact that you have survived slightly longer. In the original, you are aware that time is passing, but because it's not as in your face, the game stays scarier for longer because it feels more like progression rather than execution. Another thing to note is that a game can start to shift from scary to boring, which is also greatly related to how games use these principles. Take for instance a game like Slender Man. This game seems to use the idea of progression rather than survival longevity, but the way the game accomplishes this is very surface level. In Slender Man, you progress by collecting pages, but as soon as you've played the game, you start to realize that by surviving longer, it's nearly impossible to not progress the game. Once the player realizes what's going on, the mindset changes from trying to collect pages to trying to collect pages as quickly as possible, and as soon as this switch takes place, the game stops being scary. So we know games can be more scary by using the design principles to focus on progression rather than survival. But how do we put them into practice? To start, designers should attempt to eliminate any sense of reward while the player isn't progressing. Whether it be by backtracking, freezing, or even pausing the game, the player is receiving a sort of reward, that being a break from the intensity. People like to be rewarded, and by limiting the player's source of reward, you create a situation where the player is forced to acquire it from where you want them to. This can be done in numerous ways, but here are some simple examples. For backtracking, you can trap the player once they have made progress, whether that be by leaving a threat in the previous area or blocking it off entirely. For freezing, you can create some sort of in-world threat that chases or punishes a player that doesn't move. An excellent version of this can be seen in SCP Containment Breach. And for pausing the game, you can try to minimize the player's ability to dissociate from the game world. Maybe that music in the intense chase sequence gets louder on the pause screen instead of simply pausing. Along with tweaking the rewards and punishments, a game designer should also make sure that their goals align with these aspects. The key to remember is that completing the goal of progression inherently means the player will survive longer, but completing the goal of surviving longer doesn't inherently mean that they are progressing, and you don't want it to feel that way. Getting more items in Hello Neighbor inherently means the player has survived longer and found them, but the game feels like if you survive longer, you are inherently going to progress because you are more likely to come across more items. And last but not least, remember that players expect the consistency to lie in the idea that surviving is good. But when you focus on the idea of progressing, you can create a situation where normally negative actions have positive consequences. Forcing the player to decide between what is the least bad option is a great way to make the player more scared because the idea behind it has completely flipped. Instead of a player thinking, what will make it so nothing bad happens, they ponder the question, what bad option is more appealing to me? The player prepares themselves to be vulnerable, which makes it all the more easy to take advantage of their fears. Trying to scare someone through a game you made is one of the most difficult things you can try to do. Fear is subjective, and what you are afraid of may be someone else's comfort thought. But luckily for game designers, the way our brains scare us is a lot less subjective. So how do video games scare us? Well, they trick us into thinking that being vulnerable is what we need and, most importantly, what we want to do. Thank you everybody so much for watching, and huge thanks to my patrons on screen now. Oh, and before I go, Zelda wanted to show you guys her Halloween costume this year.
I thought she just tried to make that flower.